"I don't need a wife," Caleb Mercer said the morning the letter arrived. "I need someone who won't quit before the first snowfall." His foreman set down his coffee and said nothing. Neither did the letter. It simply told him she was already on the stagecoach. If you've ever built a life out of pure stubbornness and called it surviving, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow every part to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The advertisement had been his foreman's idea. Caleb Mercer had spent the better part of 3 days arguing against it, citing every practical reason a man with a working ranch and zero tolerance for disruption could manufacture. He was too busy. The timing was wrong. The cattle needed attention before the spring grass came in thick enough to justify moving the herd to the upper pasture. The north fence line had been sagging since February, and he hadn't found a single morning long enough to fix it properly. Pete Dawson had listened to every one of those arguments with the patient expression of a man who had heard them all before, then set the newspaper on the kitchen table, tapped the advertisement with one thick finger and said, "You're going to work yourself into the ground inside of 2 years, Caleb. Alone. I've got the hands. The hands work the cattle. Who works the house? Who manages the books? Who keeps track of what we spend on grain so we don't come up short in November like we did last year?" Caleb had stared at the table instead of the newspaper. "You don't need a sweetheart," Pete said, already pulling on his coat to leave before the argument could restart. "You need a partner. There's a difference. The advertisement's right there." He left. Caleb sat at that table for a long time. He didn't read the advertisement that night. He read it the following morning at 4 o'clock, standing at the window with a cup of black coffee going cold in his hand, watching the dark outline of the mountains press against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether to give them stars or clouds. The words were simple enough. Respectable widowers and single men operating working ranches in the Western Territories were invited to correspond with educated, capable women seeking honest partnership in frontier life. No romantic promises, no embellishment. Just the plain arrangement of two people who needed something the other could provide. He'd written the letter in 15 minutes. He hadn't thought about it much after that. That was 6 weeks ago. Now he was standing at the edge of the road that ran down into the valley where the stagecoach stopped, and he was thinking about it considerably more. Pete stood beside him, which Caleb hadn't asked for and couldn't seem to prevent. "You don't need to be here," Caleb said. "I know. This isn't a spectacle." "No, sir." "Then why are you standing there grinning?" Pete rearranged his expression into something more neutral. "Just making sure you don't say the first rude thing that comes to your mind and send her straight back to wherever she came from." Caleb didn't answer that because there was no good answer. The stagecoach came down the mountain road at its usual pace, which was to say slower than anyone would like and noisier than a rock slide. It lurched through the last curve, the driver calling down to his horses with the kind of language that suggested a complicated relationship, and rolled to a stop in a cloud of red dust that smelled like 8 hours of hard travel. 3 passengers stepped out, an older man with a merchant's belly and a ledger tucked under his arm. A young cowboy who couldn't have been more than 19 and was already looking around for the nearest saloon. And then she stepped down from the coach without waiting for assistance. That was the first thing Caleb noticed. She didn't reach for the driver's hand. She simply gathered the side of her traveling dress, tested the step with one foot to make sure it held, and came down on her own. It was a small thing. Probably nobody else noticed it. But Caleb noticed it because in 8 years of mountain living, he had learned to watch how people moved through uncertain footing and what they did when no one was watching. She stood on the road and looked around with an expression that wasn't wonder and wasn't disappointment and wasn't anything he could easily name. It was simply attention. She was cataloging the place the way a person catalogs a room they're going to have to live in. She was not what he'd pictured. He wasn't sure what he'd pictured exactly. Something softer, perhaps. Something that would make the awkwardness of this arrangement feel a little less like a business transaction conducted in public. She was average height, plainly dressed in charcoal gray, that had clearly been practical rather than fashionable even before the journey turned it dusty. Dark hair pinned back with the kind of efficiency that suggested she had no patience for things coming loose at inconvenient moments. Her face was serious. That was the word. Not severe, not unfriendly, but serious in the way that people become serious when they've had to think hard about staying in the world. She spotted him before he had finished deciding what to make of her. He knew she spotted him because her gaze stopped moving and settled on his face with the same calm, assessing quality she'd given the landscape, and he had the unsettling experience of being the thing being catalogued. He walked over. "Miss Foster." "Mr. Mercer?" Her voice was even, educated. She had a trunk and a single carpet bag, and she didn't apologize for either. "The driver tells me we're still some distance from your property. About 4 miles up." "Is the road rideable, or do you have a wagon?" "Wagon." "Good." She bent to pick up the carpet bag herself. Caleb reached it first, not out of gallantry, just instinct. She looked at him when he took it, not with gratitude and not with offense, just that same level measuring look. And he felt obscurely that he had just passed some kind of test whose rules he didn't fully understand. "I appreciate the ride," she said. "I'd like to see the property before dark if possible." "We'll make it." Pete was still standing a few yards away with an expression that Caleb was going to have words with him about later. The wagon ride up the mountain was quiet, in the way that two people are quiet when they are both too intelligent to fill silence with noise they don't mean. Abigail Foster sat with her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape with that same careful attention she'd given everything else. Once or twice, she asked a direct question. How many head of cattle? What acreage currently under crop? Whether the hay production covered winter needs or required purchasing from the valley. They were not the questions Caleb had expected. "You know ranching?" he asked after the third one. "I know accounts," she said. "The questions are the same. What comes in, what goes out, where the gaps are. You said in your letter you'd worked as an accountant. For 7 years. For a trading company in Boston." Something moved briefly across her face, too fast and too controlled to catch. The position ended. "Why?" She looked at him. He looked at the road. "The men I worked for discovered I had noticed some irregularities in the accounts," she said. "They preferred I stop noticing." "They let you go." "They had me let go, yes. There's a distinction." She paused. "They also made certain I wouldn't find another position in the city. They have a great many friends." Caleb absorbed this. "So you answered an advertisement for a ranch in Colorado." "I answered several advertisements," she said without a trace of embarrassment. "Yours was the most honest. You said you needed a capable woman to help run the property and that romance was not a condition of the arrangement. I found that—" She seemed to search briefly for the word refreshing. He looked at her then, because he hadn't quite expected that. "I didn't come west looking for a love story, Mr. Mercer," she said, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I came west looking for honest work and a place I couldn't be run out of by men with lawyers." He turned back to the road. After a moment, he said, "The north fence needs fixing." "I noticed from the road," she said. "The post spacing is inconsistent. That's usually where it fails first." Silence settled again between them, but it had changed shape. It was less like the silence of strangers, and more like the silence of two people who have just agreed without quite saying so on the terms of a difficult but necessary arrangement. The ranch revealed itself in stages as the wagon came around the last bend. Caleb watched her face when she saw it. He didn't know why he watched. Probably because Pete's voice was in his head, annoying as always, saying something about how a person's first reaction to a place tells you everything about whether they'll stay or go. She didn't exclaim. She didn't look disappointed. She leaned forward slightly the way a person leans when they want a better look at something they're already beginning to assess, and her eyes moved across the buildings and the yard and the mountain rising behind it, with that quiet, systematic attention he was beginning to recognize as simply the way she experienced the world. "The barn's bigger than the house," she said. "Cattle come first out here. I understand the priority." She studied the house for another moment. The roof on the east side needs work. I know. The garden plot's been neglected. 3 years. Herb garden or vegetable? Used to be both. She nodded once as if filing this information away under the appropriate category and climbed down from the wagon before the wheels had quite stopped. The ranch hands were curious. They managed to be curious in the way that men manage it when they know they're being watched, which is to say, badly. Hector, the youngest of the 3 full-time hands at 22, had found a reason to be fixing something directly in the line of sight from the kitchen window. Tom Briggs, who'd been with Caleb for 6 years and had the weathered dignity of a man who considered himself above gossip, was somehow also in the yard when there was no particular reason for him to be there. Even old Roy, whose knees bothered him enough that he rarely moved faster than necessary, had materialized near the porch with a very convincing air of coincidence. Caleb introduced each of them with the minimum required courtesy. Abigail shook each hand directly. Not the tentative fingertip touch of a woman trying to manage the formality, a real handshake. Hector looked startled. Tom Briggs looked... Caleb wasn't sure. Reassessed, maybe. "I'd like to see the supply records when you have a moment," she said to Caleb, "and the accounts ledger if there is one." There was one. It was not in good order. He knew this and had known it, and had been meaning to address it for the better part of 2 years. "They're in the office," he said. "I'll find them." She went inside. Roy watched her go, and then looked at Caleb with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something mildly unexpected. "She's not what I pictured," he said. "Nobody asked what you pictured, Roy?" "No, sir." Roy was quiet a moment. She shook my hand like she meant it. "Go fix the water trough." Roy went. Dinner that first night was quiet in the specific way of 2 people who are each working very hard not to make any assumptions about the other. Abigail cooked without asking whether there were preferences or dietary requirements. She opened the pantry, looked at what was there, and produced a meal that was not elaborate, but was substantially better than anything Caleb had made for himself in recent memory. She set the table with the same brisk efficiency she seemed to bring to every task. They ate. Caleb said after a while, "You don't have to cook." "I'm aware." She didn't look up from her plate. "I like cooking. It's a problem I can solve with a clear outcome." He considered this. "I should tell you," he said, "what this arrangement is and isn't. Please, you'll have your own room, the one at the back east side." He'd cleaned it himself that morning, a fact he didn't mention. "You'll have access to everything you need to run the household accounts. I'll want your help with the larger financial picture suppliers winter purchasing anything involving the bank in town." He paused. "I don't..." He stopped. Started again. "I lost my wife 8 years ago. Her and our daughter. I'm not..." Another stop. He wasn't sure why this was difficult to say to someone who had already made clear she wasn't looking for what he'd be unable to offer. "This is a practical arrangement. I want you to be clear on that." She looked up. Her eyes were gray. He hadn't noticed that before. Gray and very direct. "I lost a life I'd built in Boston," she said. "I'm not looking for consolation, Mr. Mercer. I'm looking for somewhere to be useful." She set down her fork. "I understand what this is. I respected that you were honest about it in your letter. I'd like us to be honest with each other going forward. That's all I'll ask of you." He nodded. "One more thing," she said. "What?" "The ledger in your office is 18 months behind in some entries and has at least 3 calculation errors in the winter purchasing column." He stared at her. "I noticed when I looked through it this afternoon. I can fix it this week if you'll leave me the receipts." "Where are the receipts?" She gave him a look that was not quite a smile, but occupied the same neighborhood. "I found them. They were in a boot." He had completely forgotten about the boot. He looked down at his plate. "I'll leave you the receipts," he said. He didn't sleep well that first night, which was not unusual. He lay awake in the dark, listening to the mountain sounds, the wind through the pine on the north ridge, The distant movement of cattle, the creak of the house settling, and he thought about what he'd told her. Practical arrangement. He'd meant every word of it. He'd meant it the way a man means something he has decided with his whole stubborn mind, because the alternative is a door he can't afford to open. His wife's name had been Clara. She had laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, and had grown their first garden from seeds she carried all the way from her mother's farm in Ohio, and had died on a Tuesday morning in February with their 3-day-old daughter, while he stood outside the door because the doctor had made him leave, and he had never in his life felt so completely useless in the face of something that mattered. He didn't think about Clara the way he used to. The sharpest edges had worn down over 8 years, the way everything wears down eventually, if you give it enough time and work. But the reason he didn't want a real marriage wasn't that he still loved her too much. It was simpler and harder than that. It was that he had learned definitively that you could do everything right, build the right home, make the right life, plant the right garden, and still lose everything on a Tuesday morning. He was 56 days from his 41st birthday. He was tired in a way that sleep didn't quite fix. He wasn't looking for another chance at something beautiful that could be taken away. He listened to the mountain and waited for morning. By the end of the first week, Abigail Foster had reorganized the pantry, corrected the ledger, identified a recurring overcharge from the grain supplier in the valley, and fixed the garden gate that had been hanging off one hinge for so long, Caleb had stopped seeing it. She did all of this without announcement. He noticed because noticing was something he was good at, and because it was increasingly difficult not to notice. She was up before he was, every morning. Which shouldn't have been possible. He'd been waking at 4:30 since he was 23. But somehow, it was always the case that when he came down the stairs, the stove was already going, and there was coffee, and she was either at the kitchen table with the account books, or standing at the window looking at the yard with that quiet, focused expression, mentally running through whatever list she'd assembled for the day. "Do you always wake this early?" he asked on the 4th morning, somewhat against his will. She turned from the window. "Approximately. I find the first hour useful." "For what?" "Thinking without interruption." She poured him coffee and set it on the table. "You move very quietly for a man your size." "Ranch work. You learn not to startle the cattle at 4 in the morning." The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. He was beginning to catalog these, the almost smiles, the brief shifts of expression that appeared and disappeared before they fully formed like weather that couldn't decide whether to commit. "The overcharge from the Kellerman mill," she said, sitting back down. "It's been consistent for 14 months. Small amounts each time, but they add up to—" She turned the ledger toward him and pointed to a figure she'd circled in pencil. "This." He looked at the number. It was not a trivial number. "Kellerman knows me," Caleb said. "He knows you don't check his invoices closely." She said it without accusation, just fact. "Most people don't. That's how it works." "He's been supplying this ranch for 6 years." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table. "I'd like to write him a letter, professionally worded, noting the discrepancy and requesting either a correction or an explanation." She paused. "Unless you'd prefer to handle it yourself." Caleb looked at the circle in the ledger. "Write the letter," he said. She nodded and opened her writing case. He watched her for a moment, the way she organized herself at the table, efficient and quiet, already composing the letter in her head, before her pen touched the paper. He thought about what she'd said in the wagon about the trading company in Boston, about men with lawyers, and a great many friends. He thought about what it took to land on your feet after that, and still sit at a stranger's kitchen table and write a professional letter about a grain invoice overcharge. He picked up his coffee and went to get his boots. On the 8th day, she asked about the upper pasture. Not asked exactly more that she appeared at the barn while he and Tom Briggs were reviewing the herd rotation schedule, and simply said, "I'd like to see the upper pasture before you move the second group, if there's a ride available." Tom looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Abigail. She was wearing, he noticed, practical boots, not the city shoes she'd arrived in. Boots she must have brought with some intention, because they were worn in not new, not decorative. "You ride," he said. "Not well," she said without any apparent embarrassment about this. "But adequately. I grew up on a farm in western Massachusetts before my family moved to Boston. I haven't ridden regularly in some years." He got her the mare he usually gave new hands. A brown quarter horse named Patience, who was so called because she had an extraordinary amount of it and required approximately none from her rider. Abigail checked the girth herself before mounting, which was not something he'd have expected, but maybe should have, and then they rode out. She didn't talk much on the way up. She looked at everything. The tree lines, the drainage patterns on the north slope, the condition of the creek where it crossed the trail near the old elk bedding grounds. Once she pulled the mare up and just sat for a moment, watching where the water moved over the rocks, and then said quietly, almost to herself, "The creek's feeding the lower field better than it used to. Has it been redirected?" "Not intentionally," Caleb said. "Beaver Dam upstream, maybe." She nodded. "You should check it. If it shifts again, it'll miss the field entirely, and you'll lose irrigation for the summer vegetables." He had not thought about the Beaver Dam. He would have thought about it eventually, probably. Maybe. He thought about it now. They were coming back down the mountain when she said without any particular preamble, "You had a garden once, on the south side of the house." "My wife's," he said. The word came out the same way it always did, flat and controlled the way you say a word you've had 8 years to practice. She didn't say she was sorry. He'd noticed she didn't say she was sorry about things she hadn't caused and couldn't fix, and he found himself appreciating this in a way he hadn't expected to. "The soil's still good," she said instead. "Better than the vegetable plot." She knew what she was doing. He kept his eyes on the trail. "She did," he said. "I'd like to plant it," Abigail said. "With your permission. Not to replace anything. Just the soil's too good to leave." She paused. "I can plant it differently. Whatever you're comfortable with." He said nothing for a long moment. The mare Patience picked her way around a loose stone on the trail without being asked. "Plant what you like," he said finally. He didn't look at her when he said it. She didn't look at him either. They rode the rest of the way down in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence they'd had yet. The letter to Kellerman produced a correction and a refund within 10 days. Tom Briggs told Hector that the new Mrs. Mercer had more nerve than most men he'd met, which was high praise from Tom, who had strong opinions about nerve. Hector told Roy. Roy said he'd known from the handshake. Caleb heard none of this directly. He heard it the way you hear things on a ranch, which is to say, through the specific silence of men who stop talking when you walk into a room, and the information that sits inside that silence. He didn't comment on it, but he noticed that when Abigail came out to the yard on the Friday of the second week to ask Tom about the hay storage situation because she'd been reading through the previous 2 winters' receipts and had a question about where the loss was occurring. Tom answered her like he'd answer a foreman. Not deferentially, not patiently, but directly, man, to capable person. And when Hector pointed out that the loss was mainly in the southeast corner of the hay barn, where the roof leaked, Abigail thanked him, looked at the roof, and said she'd like to look at the repair cost against the cost of the feed lost over 2 seasons. She had a notebook. She'd had a notebook since the first day. He'd seen her writing in it. That evening she sat across the table from him and set the notebook open between them. "The hay barn repair," she said, "will pay for itself in 8 months." He looked at the figures. "You worked this out today?" "This afternoon, yes." He looked at the figures again. "I can write up a material list," she said, "if you can tell me what your preferred supplier is for lumber." She paused. "One who doesn't overcharge." He met her eyes. She looked back at him steadily, and this time the almost smile went just a fraction further than usual before she looked back at the notebook. He told her about the lumber supplier. The letter from Harold Sinclair's office arrived on a Tuesday. It was addressed to Caleb Mercer, landowner, and it was written in the formal, pleasant language that lawyers use when they want to take something from you and would prefer you not realize it immediately. Sinclair, whom Caleb knew by reputation as a railroad investor with interest throughout the Colorado Territory and the disposition of a man who found the word no personally offensive, was writing to express his continued interest in acquiring the Mercer property. He understood Mr. Mercer had declined previous inquiries. He hoped Mr. Mercer might reconsider, given the generous offer enclosed, and given certain the word used was certain developments regarding the regional land survey that might bear examination. Caleb read the letter twice. He set it on the table. He went and found Abigail in the side yard, where she was directing Hector on the herb garden plot she'd been expanding from the sad remnants of whatever had been there before. "I need you to read something," he said. She looked at his face before she looked at the letter. "Come inside," she said. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table. She read it once quickly, and then she went back to the beginning and read it again more slowly. And he watched her face do something he hadn't seen it do before, go very still in a different way than her usual stillness, the way a face goes still when a person's mind is working very fast. "Certain developments regarding the regional land survey," she said. "That's what it says." "Do you have your deed?" "Of course I have my deed. And the original survey documentation." He paused. "Somewhere," he said. She looked at him with a patience that he recognized was costing her something. "I'd like to find it," she said. "Tonight. Now," she said. "If you don't mind." He minded the implication that his filing system required emergency attention. He didn't say so. He went to find the survey documentation, and while he was doing that, Abigail set the Sinclair letter on the table and put her notebook next to it and began writing things down, and her handwriting moved quickly and without hesitation. And he had the first real clear premonition that whatever this man Sinclair was beginning to try, he had done it without adequate information about what was already living on this particular ranch. It wasn't quite comfort, but it was something. He found the survey documentation in the third place he looked, which was inside the cover of an old Bible on the office shelf where he'd put it for safekeeping years ago, and then formed a very thorough mental block about. He brought it to the kitchen. She spread it on the table next to the letter and looked at both for a long time. Then she said quietly, "Mr. Mercer?" "Caleb," he said. He wasn't sure why he said it. It came out. She looked up. "Caleb," she repeated, and it sounded different in her voice than it had in his own head. More real, maybe. More like a name that belonged to a person. "This survey was recorded in 1873. I bought the land in 75. "I know, but the survey they're referencing in this letter, Sinclair's letter references a resurvey from 1871. Before your purchase." She tapped the page. "They're going to argue that the 1871 survey supersedes the recorded deed." He stared at her. "Can they do that?" "They're going to try." She straightened. "How many attorneys do you know in this county?" He named one. The one everyone used for wills and property transfers. A decent enough man who had probably never gone up against railroad lawyers in his professional life. She wrote the name down. "I want to look at the county property records," she said. "All of them, not just yours. Every parcel within 2 miles of this property." "Why?" She looked up at him again, and her gray eyes were very calm in the lamplight, and she said, "Because if Harold Sinclair is doing this to your land, he's doing it to others. And if he's doing it to others, there's a pattern, and patterns." She paused, and her pen was very still against the paper. "Patterns are what I'm good at." Outside, the wind came down off the mountain the way it always did in spring, pressing against the house, like something with weight and intention. Caleb looked at the woman sitting at his kitchen table with his deed and his survey and a notebook full of her own thoughts, and something shifted very slightly in the architecture of what he believed was still possible. He didn't name it. He wasn't ready to name it. He just looked at the wind pressing against the dark window glass and then back at her. "We'll ride to town Monday," he said. She was already writing. Monday came with cold air and a sky the color of an old bruise, the kind of morning that made every mile of mountain road feel twice as long. Caleb had the wagon ready before Abigail came out of the house, and she came out carrying her leather satchel. The good one, the one she clearly used for serious work, and he noticed without comment that she'd brought the Sinclair letter, the deed, the survey documentation, and her notebook, all organized in a manner that suggested she had spent part of Sunday preparing for exactly this trip. She climbed up without assistance. He'd stopped reaching for the offer because she never needed it, and he'd learned quickly that unnecessary gestures annoyed her, the way unnecessary words annoyed most people. They were 2 miles down the mountain before she spoke. "Tell me what you know about Sinclair," she said. Not a request. A working question. Railroad money. Denver mostly, some connections back east. Bought up 3 ranches in the valley below last year. Haggerty spread the old Comstock place and the Raines family homestead. He kept his eyes on the road. All 3 sold inside a month of receiving letters similar to the one we got. She wrote in the notebook, balancing it on her knee with the ease of long practice. Did any of them have attorneys? Haggerty tried. Man named Pollard from Glenwood Springs. Sinclair's lawyers filed so much paper against him that Pollard told Haggerty it would cost more to fight than the land was worth. He paused. Haggerty sold. And the Comstock family, the Raines, didn't even try. She closed the notebook. Not because she'd finished, he could tell she hadn't finished, but because she was thinking, and she thought better without pen in hand. "The mountain pass," she said after a moment. "Your property. Is there another route through?" Not for a railroad. Not without adding 40 miles and going through federal land that would take 10 years to permit. "So you're not one option among many. You're the only option." "That's my read." "Then he won't stop at one letter." She said it flatly, without drama. "He'll escalate. The question is how fast and what he uses." Caleb looked at the road ahead. "He'll use the law," he said. "Men like Sinclair always use the law first. It's cleaner, cheaper. And if it fails—" He stopped. "If it fails," she said, "then it becomes something else." Neither of them said what something else meant. They both knew. 8 years on an isolated mountain ranch had taught Caleb what men with money did when the law didn't cooperate, and the expression on Abigail's face told him Boston hadn't been so different. The county records office was a single room behind the courthouse presided over by a clerk named Aldous Webb, who had the watery eyes and deliberate manner of a man who had spent 30 years making sure nothing moved faster than he intended. Abigail introduced herself to Webb with a directness that stopped him mid-reach for whatever excuse he'd been preparing and asked to see the recorded property surveys for the Valley District going back to 1868. Webb looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with nothing particularly encouraging in his expression. Webb found the records. He left them at a table with 4 bound volumes, and the air of a man who wanted it noted that he was doing this under protest. Abigail opened the first volume. She read the way she did everything else, fast and thorough, her finger tracking down columns of names and dates and plot numbers, pausing occasionally to write something in her notebook, then moving on. Caleb watched for the first 10 minutes, and then started looking through the second volume, because sitting still while someone else worked was not something he did well. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He knew she was. 40 minutes in, she said, "Caleb." He looked up. She was pointing at an entry in the 3rd volume, her finger pressed against the page with a kind of controlled precision that told him she'd found something. "This survey," she said. "October 1871. It covers the eastern slope of the pass, your eastern boundary." He came around the table and read over her shoulder. "I see it. Now look at this one." She flipped forward several pages. "March 1873. Same area, different surveyor." She set her notebook open on the table so he could see what she'd written. 2 surveys of the same land within 2 years. That's unusual. Surveys are expensive. Nobody commissions one unless they need a different result from the first. He stared at the page. Someone needed the 1873 survey to say something different from 1871, or someone is now claiming that the 1871 survey says something it doesn't actually say. She turned back to the first entry. "Look at the surveyor's name on the 1871 document." He looked. J.T. Alcott. Mean anything to you? She said. Nothing. She wrote it down. It will. Yeah. They found the attorney, a man named Douglas Fry, in his office above the feed store. He was younger than Caleb had expected, maybe 35, with the careful manner of a man who had educated himself out of poverty and was not yet certain the ground under his new life was solid. Abigail laid the documents on his desk, organized in the order she'd determined mattered, and explained what she'd found in the county records with the same brisk clarity she brought to everything. Fry listened without interrupting, which improved Caleb's opinion of him somewhat. When she finished, Fry leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. If Sinclair is arguing that the 1871 survey establishes a different boundary than your deed, he said slowly, he'd need to show that the 1873 survey, the one supporting your deed, was improperly recorded or executed. Or forged, Abigail said. Fry looked at her. That's a serious word, he said. I know. She met his eyes without blinking. I spent 6 years reviewing financial documents in a trading environment where people regularly produced serious forgeries. I know what a document looks like when someone needed it to say something at a specific moment in time. She tapped the copy she'd made of the 1873 survey entry. The notary seal on this document is inconsistent with the seal used on every other document recorded by this office in the same year. I checked 11 comparable recordings. Fry went very still. You checked 11? In the 2 hours I had with the records volumes, she said. Yes. Fry looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing. Fry looked back at Abigail. Mrs. Mercer, he said, where exactly did you work in Boston? She picked up her pen. Let's discuss your retainer, she said. They were back on the mountain road before 3 o'clock, the sun making its low winter angle across the ridge and throwing long shadows down the slope. Abigail had the notebook open again, writing while the wagon moved, her handwriting barely affected by the road's roughness. He'll hear that we've been to see Fry, Caleb said. Probably within the week. Sinclair has people in town. Most men like him do. She didn't look up. Good. I want him to hear. People who think they're being watched make mistakes differently than people who think they're operating quietly. Caleb looked at her. You want him nervous? I want him impatient. She finally looked up, and her gray eyes were very clear. Impatient men rush. Rushed forgeries have errors. Errors are what I find. He turned back to the road. After a moment, he said, You've done this before. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. In Boston, she said finally. I worked alongside a man named Garrett Hale. He investigated financial crimes, fraud, embezzlement, falsified records. I wasn't his investigator. I was his accountant. But you can't work alongside someone like that for 3 years without learning how they think. She closed the notebook. When I found the irregularities in my employer's accounts, I brought them to Garrett. He helped me document everything. A pause. It wasn't enough. The men I worked for were careful. Garrett lost 2 clients because of it. I lost my position. She looked out at the ridge. But I know what careful fraud looks like. And I know that Sinclair's is not as careful as he believes. Caleb let that sit for a moment. What happened to Garrett Hale? He's in Boston, she said. He writes me occasionally. Another pause, shorter. He tried to help me find another position. There wasn't one to find. Not in that city. Not with my name attached to that company. So you came west. So I came west. She looked at him. I don't regret it. He didn't know what to do with that, so he watched the road. The first real trouble came 11 days later, and it came not from Sinclair's lawyers, but from the weather. A late spring storm rolled down from the northern peaks with the suddenness that mountain weather specializes in. No warning, no negotiation. Just a wall of cold and wet that hit the ranch, while Caleb and Tom were moving the second herd to the upper pasture, and Hector and Roy were somewhere on the far side of the property fixing a section of the eastern fence line. The storm caught the cattle badly. Three head broke from the group in the confusion and went into the tree line on the north slope. Caleb and Tom spent 3 hours in driving sleet finding them, and by the time they came back down, soaked through and cold to the marrow, the temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and the creek that fed the lower field had risen 6 inches from the snowmelt runoff. Caleb came into the house to find Abigail at the kitchen stove, and the smell of something hot and substantial hit him in the face like a physical thing. He stopped just inside the door. She turned from the stove and looked at him, the state of him, the cold and the wet, and the expression of a man who'd been fighting weather for 3 hours, and she didn't say anything sympathetic, which was exactly right, and she pointed at the chair nearest the stove, which was also exactly right. He sat. She put a bowl in front of him. "Tom," she said. "At the bunkhouse. Hector and Roy are back. Cattle are in. The creek. Rising. I'll need to look at the lower field drainage tomorrow if it holds overnight." She sat down across from him, not with food for herself, but with her notebook, and he realized she'd been working at the table while the storm came through, not doing nothing, not worrying, just working. "The hay stores," she said. How much was exposed? He'd already calculated this in his head on the ride down. "The southeast barn. What the roof hasn't been fixed on yet." She wrote something. "How much loss?" He told her. She wrote it down. "I'll adjust the winter purchasing estimate. If we order from McCarthy's in Glenwood, rather than the Valley supplier, we save enough on price to offset most of it." He looked at her across the table. "You looked at McCarthy's rates 2 weeks ago." She didn't look up. "The Valley supplier charges a transport premium that isn't justified by distance. McCarthy's is farther, but uses the rail spur, which makes it faster and cheaper." She made another note. "I was going to bring it to you next week. The storm moves it to now." He ate the soup. He thought about the fact that she had spent 2 weeks quietly improving a system he'd been running the same expensive way for 6 years. He thought about Kellerman, and the overcharge, and the boot full of receipts, and the ledger corrections, and the Sinclair letter, and the county records, and Douglas Fry, and J.T. Alcott, and the notary seal inconsistency on a document that might be the key to everything. He thought about all of it, and then he said, "The hay barn roof. I'll have Tom start on it Monday." "I already have the material estimate," she said, and turned the notebook so he could see the page. The second trouble came from Hector, which Caleb hadn't anticipated. Not trouble exactly. More that Hector came to him on a Thursday morning with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a young man who has been thinking hard about something for several days, and has finally decided he has to say it. "It's about the eastern fence line," Hector said. "What about it?" "When Roy and I were out there in the storm, we found something. Tracks. Not cattle tracks." Hector's jaw was set in the way of a man delivering information he'd rather not. "Boot tracks from the east side of the property line. 2 sets. And the fence in that section." He paused. "The fence didn't break in the storm, Mr. Mercer. Someone cut it. Clean. 1 wire right at the post." Caleb was very still. "When?" "Before the storm, I think. The cuts were clean at the edges, and if the wire had been down long in the wet, it would have started to rust differently. Roy agrees. Someone had been on his property. Someone with wire cutters." "You're sure it was cut?" "Yes, sir." Hector met his eyes. "I brought the wire. I've got it in the barn if you want to look." Caleb looked at the barn, and then at the house, and made a decision. "Come inside," he said. Abigail looked at the wire for a long time. She turned it in her hands, examining the cut end with the focused, unhurried attention she gave to documents and ledgers, and everything else that held information people thought was hidden. "He's testing you," she said. "Sinclair. His people. Not him directly. Men like Sinclair don't cut fences. They hire men who do." She set the wire on the table. "This is a message. It says we can access your property. We can move on your land, and you can't stop us. It's designed to make you afraid." "I'm not afraid," Caleb said. "I know." She looked up at him. "But he doesn't know that yet. He thinks you're like the Haggerty family." He thinks the letter will work, and if the letter doesn't work, the next thing will." She was quiet for a moment. "We need to respond in a way that shows him the letter didn't work." "How?" "By doing something visible in town." She folded her hands. "I want to file a formal response to the Sinclair letter with the county clerk. Publicly. On the record. Contesting the surveying claim and noting the inconsistencies we found." She paused. "I also want to send copies to the other ranchers in the valley. Haggerty the Comstock airs anyone who sold under similar circumstances." Caleb stared at her. "You want to go public?" Sinclair's strategy depends on each person feeling alone, feeling like fighting is too expensive and too uncertain, and no one else is on their side. She held his gaze. The moment the ranchers in this valley realize they all received the same letter, at the same time, with the same legal language, it becomes something a county judge can't ignore. He thought about the Haggerty family. 3 generations on that land. Sold inside of a month. "Haggerty's already gone," he said. "Land's already transferred." A transfer obtained through fraudulent survey documentation is not a legal transfer. She said it quietly, precisely. Mr. Fry confirmed that last week. If the 1873 survey is forged, and I believe it is, then every transaction that depends on it is contestable. Caleb sat back. The kitchen was quiet except for the stove and the wind outside. "You're talking about unwinding Sinclair's entire acquisition," he said. "I'm talking about establishing the truth of what happened." She leaned forward slightly. "Let the court decide what to do with it." He looked at her for a long moment. He'd spent 8 years running this ranch alone, making every decision alone, building every system alone, and letting it fall behind, and patching it with more solitude, and more stubbornness, and more early mornings in the dark. He was not accustomed to someone presenting him with a plan that was better than the one he'd have made himself. He wasn't sure how to hold that. He wasn't sure it was comfortable. He was sure it was right. "Write the filing," he said. "I'll take it to Fry in the morning." The response from Sinclair's office came faster than either of them expected. Not another letter. A man. He appeared at the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon, arriving in a quality buggy that was wrong for a mountain road, and wearing a suit that was wrong for Colorado in general, and he introduced himself as Mr. Patterson, representative of Mr. Sinclair's interests, in a tone that suggested representing Mr. Sinclair's interests was a position of some distinction. Caleb met him in the yard. Patterson smiled with the practiced ease of a man who'd delivered this particular performance many times. "Mr. Mercer, a pleasure. Mr. Sinclair asked me to convey his personal respects and to clarify that his recent correspondence was intended in entirely good faith. He's concerned there may have been some misunderstanding." "There wasn't," Caleb said. Patterson's smile didn't waver. "He'd like to offer you an opportunity to discuss the property valuation directly in a more personal setting. He's prepared to—" "Mr. Mercer." Abigail's voice came from behind him. She'd come out of the house without him hearing, and she was standing at his shoulder with her satchel in hand, and her expression set in the mode he had come to think of as professional, which meant perfectly polite and completely immovable. Patterson looked at her. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, recalibrating with the smoothness of long practice. "How delightful! Mr. Sinclair had no idea. Any communication regarding this property," Abigail said, opening the satchel and producing a folded document, "should now be directed to our attorney, Mr. Douglas Fry, at this address." She held the document out. "You'll also want to be aware that we have filed a formal contest of the survey claim in county records, and copies have been sent to 7 other property owners in this valley who received correspondence similar to ours." She paused. "Including the Haggerty family." Patterson took the document. His smile had developed a rigidity it hadn't had 30 seconds ago. "Mrs. Mercer," he said carefully, "I don't think you fully appreciate the—" "I appreciate it quite fully," she said. "I spent 6 years in contract and financial review in Boston, Mr. Patterson. I've seen similar arrangements." Her gray eyes were very calm. Tell Mr. Sinclair that we're not the Haggerty family." Patterson looked at the document. He looked at Caleb. Caleb looked back at him with nothing encouraging in his expression. "I'll convey the message," Patterson said. "Thank you for the visit," Abigail said. "Tom will see you to the road." Tom Briggs, who had materialized from the direction of the barn with the timing of a man who had been watching from the moment the buggy appeared, stepped forward with an expression of extreme helpfulness. Patterson went. Caleb watched the buggy until it was out of the yard, and then he looked at Abigail. She was putting the document back in the satchel. "You went out to the other families," he said, "without telling me." "I sent letters," she said. "Last week, after you approved the filing." She closed the satchel. "I should have told you directly. I'm used to working independently." "On my property." "On our property," she said, and looked up. The words sat in the air between them. She held his gaze not with challenge and not with apology, just the straight-ahead honesty that was apparently as fundamental to her as breathing. He exhaled. "What did the families say?" he said. "The ones you wrote to." "I've heard back from 4. The Raines family and 2 others want to meet." She paused. "Haggerty hasn't responded yet, but his daughter did." Something moved in her face, brief controlled. "She said her father cried when he read the letter." Caleb said nothing. He looked at the road where the buggy had gone. "Set up the meeting," he said. 3 weeks after Patterson's visit, the meetings had happened. Fry had filed additional documentation with the court, and Abigail had produced a 60-page summary of the surveying inconsistencies backed by cross-referenced county records going back 18 years. She'd worked on it mostly at night at the kitchen table by lamplight, and Caleb had come downstairs more than once at 2 in the morning to find her still there, pen-moving, notebook filled, another page completed. The first time he'd stood in the doorway and said nothing, and she'd looked up and said, "Go back to sleep." "You should sleep." "I will." She turned back to the page. "After this section." He stood there a moment longer. "Do you want coffee?" She looked up again. Something shifted in her expression. Surprise, maybe. Small and quickly managed. "Yes," she said. "Please." He made coffee. He sat across from her while she worked, not asking questions, not offering commentary, just present. Drinking his coffee. Occasionally handing her a reference document she'd set on the wrong side of the table and needed without looking up. They stayed like that for an hour. He didn't know what to call it. He just knew that when he finally went back upstairs, the house felt different than it had before. Not crowded, not complicated, less empty. He didn't examine this feeling because he wasn't ready to examine it. He just let it sit there in the dark of the bedroom unnamed and waited for morning. Haggerty's response came on a Saturday. Not a letter. The man himself. 71 years old, drove his own wagon up the mountain road alone, which Caleb respected more than he could say. He was a big man, gone thin in the way of men who've lost something that held them together. He sat at Caleb's kitchen table and held his hat in both hands, and didn't speak for a long moment after Abigail laid the documents in front of him, the summary, the survey analysis, the county record comparisons. Then he said, "Can you get my land back?" Abigail looked at him steadily. "I can't promise you the outcome," she said. "I can promise you the fight is real, the fraud is real, and you are not alone in it." Haggerty looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "I should have come to you sooner. I'm sorry I didn't." The old man pressed his lips together. He looked back at the documents. "My grandfather built the house on that land," he said. "Hauled the timber himself. I've got the notches in the doorframe where we measured my kids every year." He was quiet. "Sinclair's men put a lock on the door last month." Abigail's jaw tightened. Just barely. Caleb noticed. "Mr. Haggerty," she said, "I need you to tell me everything you remember about the day you signed the sale documents. Everything Sinclair's lawyers said to you. Everything they claimed about the survey." Haggerty put his hat on the table. "I've got time," he said. She opened the notebook to a fresh page, and the pen began to move. and Caleb sat back and watched the woman his foreman had convinced him to send for the one who was not glamorous and not cheerful, and who shook hands like she meant it, systematically dismantle Harold Sinclair's confidence that this mountain pass was already his. He thought about what Pete had said. You need a partner. There's a difference. He looked at her hand moving across the page. He thought that Pete, infuriating as he was, had occasionally been right about things before. Haggerty left the ranch that Saturday with a copy of every document Abigail had assembled, and the expression of a man who had walked in carrying a weight he'd believed was permanent, and walked out carrying something else instead. Not hope exactly. Something more durable than hope. Purpose. Caleb watched the wagon go down the mountain road, and then stood in the yard for a moment in the cold afternoon air, thinking about the notches in a doorframe, measuring children who were now grown, and a house with a lock on it that didn't belong to the man who'd built it. He went inside. Abigail was still at the table reviewing what Haggerty had told her, cross-referencing his account against the survey documents with the focused intensity she brought to everything that mattered. She had 3 pages of new notes, and she hadn't looked up when Caleb came back in. His account confirms the timeline, she said without preamble. Sinclair's lawyers told him the resurvey was a routine government proceeding, that it had nothing to do with his ownership, that signing the transfer was actually protecting him from potential legal complications. She turned a page. They lied to him in 6 different directions at once, and he had no one to tell him otherwise. He's a rancher, Caleb said, not a lawyer. That's exactly what they counted on. She set the pen down. Caleb, the man who presented those documents to Haggerty, his name was Aldrich, regional counsel for Sinclair's railroad interests. I want Fry to subpoena his correspondence. Can Fry do that? If we get in front of the right judge, yes. She looked up. The problem is that the county judge assigned to property disputes in this district has been ruling in Sinclair's favor consistently for 14 months, on cases that should have gone the other way. The implication sat between them like something with weight. You think Sinclair has the judge? Caleb said. I think it's possible. She was careful with the word possible he'd noticed. She didn't overstate what she knew. Which means we need to get this case moved to the district court in Denver. Federal jurisdiction if we can frame it correctly. How do we frame it correctly? We demonstrate that the fraudulent surveying affected multiple property owners across county lines, which it did. The Comstock property crosses into the next county. She stood and carried her notes to the shelf where she'd organized the case documents in a series of folders she'd made herself from cardboard and paper. The moment it crosses county lines, it becomes a matter for the district court. Caleb watched her file the notes. You knew this from the beginning, he said, when you were looking at the county records that first day. She paused with her hand on the folder. I suspected it, she said. I didn't say anything because suspicion isn't useful. Evidence is. She turned around. Now I have enough to suspect with confidence. He almost smiled at that. Almost. The hay barn burned on a Tuesday night 3 weeks later. Not the main barn. Caleb had men sleeping near the main barn after the fence incident, and everyone understood why. The hay barn. The southeast one, with the recently repaired roof that Abigail had priced out and scheduled and overseen until Tom Briggs had it done properly. The fire started after midnight. Roy smelled it first. Roy, whose knees were bad and who slept lighter than any of them, and his shout brought everyone out in time to save the structure, but not the winter hay stored inside. 2 months of supply gone. Caleb stood in the yard in the dark and looked at what was left. He didn't speak for a long time. Tom stood beside him. Hector. Roy with his knees and his grim expression. And Abigail, who had come out of the house with her coat thrown over her nightdress and had assessed the situation in 30 seconds, and then stood quietly at Caleb's shoulder without saying anything unnecessary. Finally, Caleb said, Anyone hurt? No, sir, Tom said. Cattle. Clear. 'Cause... Tom hesitated. That hesitation told Caleb everything. Tell me, Caleb said. Accelerant, Tom said. On the south wall, Roy found the smell before the smoke got heavy enough to mask it. Silence. "All right," Caleb said. He turned and went back inside. Abigail followed him. She didn't speak until they were in the kitchen, and he'd sat down at the table with the particular stillness of a man managing something that wanted to become something else. "We document this tonight," she said, "while it's fresh, before anything gets touched." "Abigail, I know." Her voice was steady, but not cold. "I know what this feels like. Document first, then feel it." He looked at her. She was standing across the table from him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders for the first time he'd seen it. Her eyes very direct in the lamplight, and she was holding her notebook, and she was asking him to hold himself together for another hour, because another hour mattered. He picked up his pen. They documented everything. The report went to Fry the next morning, and from Fry to the county sheriff, a man named Brixton, who listened to everything they presented with the careful attention of someone who wanted to be seen as thorough without committing to actually being thorough. Brixton said he'd look into it. Caleb had heard that before from men who meant nothing by it. But something else happened when they filed the arson report. A deputy Young knew, recently transferred from the state office in Denver, took his own set of notes. His name was Calloway. And when Abigail laid out the documented timeline of events, the letter, the fence, the Patterson visit, the public filing, and now the fire deputy, Calloway's expression shifted into something that looked like recognition. Afterward, in the corridor outside Brixton's office, Calloway caught up with them. "Mrs. Mercer," he said quietly, "the pattern you described. Has Fry made contact with the state attorney's office in Denver?" Abigail looked at him carefully. "Not yet." "He should." Calloway glanced back toward the sheriff's office. The man who reviewed county land disputes before Brixton took office filed a report 18 months ago flagging irregular survey activity in this district. That report was... He paused, choosing his word. "Redirected." "Redirected where?" Caleb said. Calloway looked at him. "To Sinclair's county contact, a man named Webb. Aldous Webb, the county records clerk with the watery eyes and the deliberate manner." Caleb and Abigail looked at each other. "Thank you, Deputy," Abigail said. "I didn't say anything," Calloway said, and walked away. She was up before 4 the next morning, which even by her standards was early. Caleb found her at the kitchen table with every document spread before her, working through them in an order that clearly made sense to her, even if the arrangement looked chaotic to anyone else. "Webb," he said, sitting down. "Webb." She didn't look up. "He's been in that records office for 30 years. Every survey filing, every property transfer, every county record goes through him." She turned a page. "He's the one who would have had access to the original 1873 survey. He's the one who could have altered the notary seal or substituted a page." She paused. "He's also the one who gave us those records volumes without apparent concern, which means either he's confident the alteration isn't detectable," she finally looked up, "or he doesn't know that I already know what a substituted page looks like." "Which is it?" "I don't know yet." She sat back. "I need to see the original document, not a copy, the physical original in the binding. Webb controls access to the physical records." "Yes." She folded her hands. "Which means I need someone who can get to the physical records without going through Webb." She was quiet a moment. "Does Fry have standing to request the originals for court evidence?" "Ask him. I already sent him a letter yesterday." She picked up the pen again. "He'll have an answer by Thursday." Caleb sat across from her in the 4 o'clock kitchen and thought about what it meant that she'd anticipated this 2 days before he'd known enough to ask the question. He thought about a lot of things at 4 in the morning lately. He poured them both coffee. She looked up at the cup he set in front of her with that brief small expression, the one that occupied the space where a smile would go, and went back to work. Thursday brought Fry's answer and something else. The something else was a letter from the Raines family forwarded through Fry's office, and it contained a piece of information that stopped Abigail mid-sentence when she was reading it aloud to Caleb. She stopped. She went back to the beginning of the paragraph and read it again silently. "What?" Caleb said. She set the letter flat on the table. "The surveyor," she said. "J.T. Alcott, the one who signed the 1871 survey." "What about him?" "Eleanor Raines. She's 73. Her husband passed 2 years ago. She says she remembers Alcott. He surveyed their property in 1870. She says he was a good man, honest." Abigail's voice was careful and precise. "She says he died in the spring of 1871, February." The kitchen was very quiet. "The survey is dated October 1871, Caleb said. "Yes." "A dead man signed a survey document. Someone signed it using his name." She looked up. "Someone who knew he was dead and knew there was no one to contradict the signature." Caleb stood up. He walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for a moment, not because he needed to look at anything outside, but because he needed to move, needed to do something with the specific anger that came from understanding the full shape of what had been done to his neighbors. Haggerty's land. The Raines homestead. 3 generations. A man's grief over a locked door and notches in a doorframe. He turned back around. "This ends it," he said. "A forged signature on a document using a dead man's name that's not a land dispute. That's criminal fraud." "Yes," Abigail said, "and it's provable. If we can establish Alcott's death date through county records, death certificates, cemetery records, anything official, and compare it to the survey signature, can we prove the signature is forged? We don't have to prove it's forged if we can prove it's impossible." She was already writing. "A man who died in February of 1871 cannot have surveyed land in October of 1871. That's not forgery. That's a document that cannot be authentic. No handwriting expert, no lawyer, no judge can argue with a death certificate." "Where are the death records?" "County Records Office." She looked at him steadily. "Webb's office." He understood. If Webb knows we're looking for death records, then the records might not be there when we look. She nodded. "Which is why Fry needs to subpoena the originals simultaneously, death records and survey documents at the same time, before Webb knows why we need them. Fry will need cause for the subpoena. Fry has cause." She picked up the Raines letter and held it up. "Eleanor Raines is willing to provide a sworn statement about Alcott. That's cause." Caleb grabbed his coat from the hook by the door. "Can you have the affidavit drafted by tomorrow morning?" "It'll be done tonight," she said, and reached for a clean sheet of paper. The subpoena was filed on a Friday. By Saturday, Aldous Webb had requested an emergency consultation with the county judge. By Sunday, the county judge, whose consistent rulings for Sinclair had begun attracting the attention Abigail had intended, sent a carefully worded response to Fry, noting that the subpoena was in order and would be honored. By Monday morning, they had the death records. James Thomas Alcott died February 14, 1871. Recorded and certified by the county coroner. Cause of death pneumonia. Buried at the Glenwood Springs Community Cemetery. 8 months before the survey that bore his name. Fry sat in his office above the feed store and looked at the death certificate and the survey document side by side for a long time. Then he looked at Abigail, then at Caleb. "This is it," he said. "Yes," Abigail said. "Sinclair's lawyers are going to argue the records are mistaken. They'll attack the death certificate, the date the certifying official. The certifying official in 1871 was a man named Dr. Henry Marsh." Abigail said, opening her notebook to the relevant page. "He practiced in Glenwood Springs until 1889. He is currently retired and living in Colorado Springs. I have his address." Fry stared at her. "You found the coroner," he said. "I found the retired coroner," she said. "He's 81. He's in good health according to his neighbor whom I wrote to last week. And I believe that a man who has certified deaths for 30 years in this territory will have a very clear opinion about whether his own signature on a document is authentic." Caleb watched Fry process this. Fry was a careful man, a methodical man, a man who had educated himself by sheer application and had a respect for thoroughness that came from understanding what happened when preparation failed. He processed what Abigail had just told him, and he set his hands flat on the desk and said, "Mrs. Mercer, I need to ask you something." "Ask." "When you were in Boston, working alongside the investigator." Fry paused. "How many cases did you help him build?" She looked at Fry for a moment. "Enough," she said. "Did any of them go to trial?" "Two." She didn't look away. "We lost both. The men we went up against had better lawyers and better connections and more money to spend on both." She was quiet for a moment. "But those cases were built on financial records, ledgers, numbers that could be disputed." She set her hand on the documents spread across Fry's desk, the death certificate, the survey, the Raines affidavit. Eleanor Raines's precise elderly handwriting confirming a dead man's name on a false document. "This is different. You can argue about numbers. You cannot argue that a man surveyed land after he was buried." Fry looked at the documents. He nodded once, slowly. "I'm going to file for a federal district hearing," he said. "Denver. We go over the county judge's head entirely." "That's what I was hoping you'd say," Abigail said. Sinclair's response came in layers, and it came fast. The first layer was legal, a counterfiling, challenging the jurisdiction, disputing the subpoena, and questioning the authenticity of the death certificate itself, with the audacity of people who had never yet been told no with sufficient force. The second layer was personal. A man appeared in town asking questions about Abigail. Not Caleb Abigail. About her history in Boston, about why she'd left, about the trading company and the position she'd lost, and the men who'd arranged for her to be discredited. Fry heard about it and sent word to Caleb on a Wednesday. Caleb told Abigail that evening. She was at the kitchen table. She went very still when he told her the kind of stillness that came after something landed harder than expected, and he watched her manage it, the quick tightening of her jaw, the deliberate unclenching of her hands in her lap, the breath she took, and the one after it. "They're going to try to use Boston," she said. "Looks like. They'll say I was dismissed for cause, that I falsified records, that my judgment isn't credible." She was working through it aloud, not asking for reassurance, just mapping the terrain the way she mapped everything. Standard procedure: when you can't defeat the evidence, you defeat the person presenting it. "It's not true," Caleb said. "It doesn't need to be true. It needs to be complicated enough that a judge has to consider it." She pressed her lips together. "Garrett Hale, my contact in Boston. He has documentation of what actually happened, what the company did, what I found, why I was removed. I need to write to him. Tonight." Tonight. Tonight. She looked up at him. "If they're already sending men to ask questions in town, they're moving faster than I thought, which means they're afraid of the death certificate. Which means—" She stopped. "Which means we're closer than we thought," Caleb said. "Yes." She looked at her hands. "And closer means more dangerous." He sat down across from her. "Abigail." He waited until she looked at him. "What happened in Boston? The men who did that to you. Do you think Sinclair has contacted them?" The question was direct. He meant it to be. She held his gaze with the steadiness she always held it, but something moved behind her eyes, something that had been there from the beginning, from the wagon ride up the mountain. From the first day she'd cataloged this ranch and this life, and decided it was worth staying in. "It's possible," she said. "Men like Sinclair reach far." She was quiet. "I knew when I started filing publicly that this was a possibility, that they'd come after who I am, rather than what I found." A pause. "I chose to file anyway." "Why?" She looked at the documents spread across the table. Haggerty's testimony. Eleanor Raines's handwriting, a dead man's name on a false survey. Everything she'd built over months of early mornings and lamplight nights. "Because what they did to Haggerty is wrong," she said simply, "and someone who knows what I know has to say so. Caleb looked at the table too. After a long moment, he said, "Write the letter to Hale. I'll post it in the morning myself." She pulled the writing paper toward her. Then she stopped, and she said something he hadn't expected. "Thank you," she said, "for believing what I found." He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the directness that had never wavered, not once, not in the hardest moments, but there was something in it now that wasn't quite the same as the careful steadiness he'd gotten used to. Something more open, more unguarded than she usually allowed. "You gave me reason to," he said. She held his gaze for just a moment more, and then she looked down and began to write, and he got up to put more wood in the stove, and neither of them said anything else. And the silence in the kitchen was the fullest silence the house had held since she'd arrived. The letter to Garrett Hale produced a response in 11 days. Hale's reply was 3 pages long, precise, and contained 2 things Abigail had hoped for and one she hadn't anticipated. The first, his complete documentation of the Boston events, certified and notarized, ready to present to any court as evidence of her credibility and the company's actions. The second, his personal willingness to travel to Colorado and testify if the case required it. The third, a name. "There is one additional matter," Hale wrote, "which I believe you will find relevant to your current situation. A man named Patterson, identified as regional counsel for a railroad interest in Colorado, made inquiries to my office last month regarding your history. I declined to assist him. However, in researching his background to understand his client's motive, I discovered that Patterson was previously employed by a Boston firm that represented—" Abigail read the name that followed. She sat very still. She read it again. Then she got up and found Caleb in the barn. "The men in Boston," she said. "The trading company partners who had me removed. One of them is a financial backer in Sinclair's railroad venture." Caleb looked at her. "They're connected," he said. "They were always connected." Her voice was controlled, but her eyes were alive with the particular fire that came when evidence aligned with suspicion and became certainty. "This wasn't a coincidence that I ended up here. Well," she stopped. "The advertisement was coincidence. But Sinclair's interest in your land, and the methods he used, and the men behind those methods, they're the same men who built the same fraud in Boston that I uncovered 6 years ago." She held up the letter. "I didn't come west to escape them. I came west, and they followed their own scheme directly to me. Can you prove the connection?" "Hale can. He has their financial records from the Boston investigation." She folded the letter carefully. "Combined with what we have here, the forged survey, the dead man's signature, Webb's access to the records, Sinclair's acquisition pattern." She looked at him. "Caleb, this is not a Colorado land case. This is a multi-state fraud operation. The federal district court isn't just the right venue. It's the only venue with jurisdiction over everything." He took the letter from her and read the name. He read it twice. He was not a man who frightened easily. 8 years on an isolated mountain ranch had cured him of the easier fears and burned away the rest. But standing there reading that name, he felt the specific coldness of understanding that they were not fighting a regional opportunist with railroad money. They were fighting something that reached from Colorado to Boston and had been operating for years. "Fry," he said. "Today. I already saddled my horse," she said. Fry read Hale's letter with the expression of a man watching the scale of a problem revise itself upward in real time. When he finished, he set it on the desk and was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than usual. "If this connection is documentable," he said carefully, "then what we're filing is no longer a property dispute. It's a racketeering case." "Yes," Abigail said. "The federal district court in Denver handles this, but they'll want a federal prosecutor to take the lead. Can you make that introduction?" Fry looked at her. "I know a man in the federal attorney's office. We studied together in Chicago." He paused. "I always thought the law was the whole game. You're telling me the board is bigger than I thought." "The board is always bigger than anyone thinks," Abigail said, "until someone draws the full picture." Fry picked up his pen. "Let me write that letter," he said. The sabotage escalated 4 days later. The bridge that connected the upper pasture to the main ranch, the one that let them move cattle without going the long way around the North Ridge, adding 3 miles to every drive, was destroyed overnight. Not collapsed from where? Destroyed. Planks removed supports cut the kind of deliberate, systematic dismantling that took time and knowledge of the property. Tom Briggs found it at dawn and came back to the ranch with his jaw set and the expression of a man who had moved past surprise into something harder. Caleb stood at the site and looked at what had been done and did the calculation in his head: weeks to rebuild, cost of materials every cattle drive this season going the long way. The accumulated damage was becoming significant. That was the point. Abigail stood beside him. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He's trying to make you too tired to fight." "I know." He almost succeeded with Haggerty. "I know that too." She turned to look at him directly. "Are you tired?" He looked at the destroyed bridge, at the mountain rising above it, at the sky that was the particular blue of Colorado in late spring that he'd been looking at for 8 years and never quite stopped noticing. He thought about Clara and the garden and the door frame notches he didn't have and the 8 years of building a life out of stubbornness, because stubbornness was what remained when everything else was taken. He thought about Haggerty's face at this kitchen table, the old man holding his hat in both hands, the locked door. He thought about Abigail at 2 a.m. with the lamplight and the notebook and the coffee he'd made without being asked, because it was the only help he knew how to offer when the help that mattered was already being done without him. "No," he said. "I'm not tired." She nodded once. "Then let's go fix this bridge," she said. And there was something in the way she said it. Not dramatically, not with a speech, just plainly and practically, the way she said everything that mattered, that made him understand she didn't just mean the bridge. She meant all of it. Every cut fence and burned hay and locked door and forged name on a dead man's survey. She meant all of it, and she wasn't leaving, and she'd already known the answer before she asked the question, and she'd asked it because she knew he needed to say it out loud. He looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said. Which wasn't something he said. She looked back at him and said nothing, which was exactly right. Then she turned to Tom Briggs and said, "What do we need for the bridge? Give me a materials list." Tom gave her the list. She wrote it in the notebook, and the work began again. The bridge took 9 days to rebuild. Caleb and Tom and Hector worked it in the mornings before the day's regular demands took over, and Abigail managed the material sourcing with the efficiency she brought to everything. Finding a lumber contact through McCarthy's rail connection that saved them $11 and 4 days of wait time. Roy, whose knees wouldn't let him work the structure itself, kept the coffee coming and the lunch ready, and muttered continuously about men who destroyed other men's bridges, which was the most sustained emotional commentary any of them had ever heard from him. On the 7th day, while Caleb was working a replacement support beam into place with Tom holding the other end and Hector driving the bolts, Abigail appeared at the edge of the worksite with the notebook and said without greeting. Fry's contact at the federal attorney's office wrote back. Caleb didn't put down the beam. "Read it," he said. She read it. The federal attorney's office in Denver had reviewed the materials Fry forwarded. They were opening a preliminary inquiry. An investigator would travel from Denver within the month. In the meantime, all evidence was to be preserved. No original documents were to leave their current location. And the Mercer property was not, the word was underlined, not to be sold or transferred under any circumstances, regardless of any legal pressure applied at the county level. Tom let out a breath that wasn't quite a word. Hector said something in Spanish that was probably a prayer. Caleb set the beam down carefully, because dropping it would undo the morning's work, and then he straightened up and looked at Abigail across the unfinished bridge. She was watching him with that level, quiet gaze, the notebook closed now in both hands, waiting. "How long before the inquiry becomes a case?" he said. "Fry estimates 4 to 6 months before any formal hearing. Possibly longer." She paused. "In the meantime, Sinclair's lawyers will keep filing at the county level. The county judge will keep ruling. Fry will keep appealing. It's going to be loud, and it's going to be expensive, and—" She stopped. "And what?" "And Sinclair is going to try something before the federal investigator arrives," she said. "I don't know what. But men who've operated this way for years don't simply stop because someone filed paperwork in Denver. They accelerate." Hector looked at Caleb. Tom looked at the tree line. Roy, from somewhere behind them, stopped muttering. "All right," Caleb said. He picked up his hammer. "Let's finish this bridge." Sinclair accelerated in a way none of them had predicted. Not another physical attack. Something cleaner. Something that used the systems they were trying to use against them. A court filing appeared at the county level new, separate from the existing dispute claiming that Caleb Mercer had failed to meet the legal residency requirements for the original land grant under the Homestead Act of 1862. The claim alleged that during the winter of 1878, Caleb had been absent from the property for more than the legally permitted consecutive days, which under a specific and obscure provision of the original grant terms, constituted grounds for reversion of the land to public domain, at which point it could be legally surveyed, claimed, and assigned. Fry brought the filing personally riding up the mountain on a Thursday afternoon, which he'd never done before. The fact that he rode up himself rather than send a letter told Caleb everything before Fry opened his mouth. Caleb read the filing. He read it again. "The winter of 1878, he said. "Yes." Caleb set the paper on the table. Clara had died in February of 1878, their daughter 3 days before her. He had left the ranch for 16 days, the longest 16 days of his life, to take them both to his wife's family in Ohio for burial, because Clara had asked him once early in their marriage to promise her that much. He'd come back to an empty house and started the work of surviving. "They found out about my wife," he said. "Someone talked," Fry said. "Someone who knew the timeline. Or someone went through county records," Abigail said quietly. She was standing at the far end of the table and her voice was very careful. "Marriage certificate, death records. A man's grief is a public document if you know where to look." The silence in the kitchen was different from other silences. Caleb was quiet for a long time. He'd spent 8 years not talking about those 16 days. Not because the memory was unbearable, he'd made his peace with unbearable or something close enough to it, but because they were his in private, and the thought of Harold Sinclair's lawyers reaching into that grief and pulling it out to use as a legal instrument was the specific kind of violation that moved in a man's chest differently than anger. "They're going to put it in front of a judge," he said. "Next month," Fry said. "County level before we can get the federal case fully established." "Can we challenge it?" "Absolutely." Fry leaned forward. "The Homestead Act provision they're citing is legitimate but narrow. The exemption for circumstances of documented family emergency is also legitimate and well established in case law. We need documentation of where you went, why, and for how long." He paused. "Death records, burial records, any correspondence. Anything that establishes the trip was for the interment of immediate family." Caleb nodded. He knew where the records were. He'd kept them the way he kept things that mattered and were too painful to look at regularly in a specific place where he always knew they were, which meant he could leave them alone. "I'll get them," he said. He got up and went to the bedroom. He was gone for about 10 minutes. When he came back, he set a small bundle of papers on the table. Clara's death certificate, their daughter's, the letter from the Ohio pastor confirming the burial, a train ticket stub he'd kept for no reason he could have explained at the time. He set them down, and he didn't look at Abigail. Abigail didn't look at him either, which was the right thing to do. She picked up the documents gently and read each one carefully, and then set them in a neat stack beside Fry's filing. "This is sufficient," she said. "More than sufficient. The exemption is clear." "Agreed," Fry said. "I'll file the response by Monday." "File it Friday," Abigail said. "Don't give them the weekend to adjust their argument." Fry looked at her and then wrote something in his own notebook. "Friday," he said. Caleb didn't sleep well that Thursday night, which wasn't new, but the reason was different. It wasn't the legal case or the federal inquiry or Sinclair's latest maneuver. It was the train ticket stub. The way it had sat on the table under Fry's legal documents and Abigail's careful hands, this small piece of paper from 16 days in the winter of 1878 that he'd carried from Ohio back to Colorado in his coat pocket and then put away in the same drawer as Clara's death certificate, because there was nowhere else that made sense for it. He lay in the dark and thought about the fact that Abigail had touched those documents with exactly the same gentleness she brought to the survey maps and the ledger pages and the Raines letter, as if the weight of what they represented was something she could feel through the paper and chose to honor. He thought about that for a long time. He thought about other things too. About the morning she'd asked permission to plant Clara's garden. About the way she said "our property" without flinching, and then held his gaze waiting to see how he'd hold it. About 2 o'clock in the morning and coffee, and an hour of shared silence that had been, if he was honest with himself, the least alone he'd felt since before 1878. He was 56 days from 41 years old. He'd made a decision 8 years ago that felt permanent at the time, the kind of decision grief makes for you and you let stand because it requires less courage than the alternative. He lay in the dark and thought about courage. He didn't reach any conclusions, but he was awake for a long time. The county hearing on the Homestead Act claim was set for a Friday morning in the third week of June. The week before it, 3 things happened. The first was that Garrett Hale arrived from Boston. He was shorter than Caleb had pictured, a compact, precise man of about 50, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the particular energy of someone who has spent decades caring enormously about things other people preferred to ignore. He arrived on the Tuesday stage and came directly to the ranch, because Abigail had written asking him to, and he walked into the kitchen and looked at the organized case documents spread across 2 tables and said, "You've been thorough. We've had time," Abigail said. "You've also been targeted." He looked at her with the concern of a man who had known her before this and understood what she'd already survived. "They contacted my office again last month, looking for anything they could use." "I know." She didn't look disturbed. "What did they find?" "Nothing." He sat down. "Because there's nothing to find." He opened his own case and set a bound folder on the table. "This is everything from the Boston investigation. Certified copies. Notarized. The connection between Sinclair's financial backers and your former employers is documented on pages 12 through 19. Abigail opened the folder to page 12. She read for 60 seconds. Then she turned it so Caleb could see. He read the names, the amounts, the dates of financial transfers between a Boston trading company and a Colorado railroad venture going back 4 years. 2 years before Abigail had ever answered an advertisement in a newspaper. "They were always connected," Caleb said. "The fraud in Boston funded the initial land acquisitions here," Hale said. "The money Abigail's former employers made through the falsified trading accounts went into Sinclair's railroad project, which is why—" He looked at Abigail. "When you started asking questions in Boston, it wasn't just a local trading company that wanted you silenced. It was Sinclair's investors," she said. "Yes." Caleb set down the folder. "She was a threat to this operation before she ever came west," he said. Not to Hale, to himself really, understanding something he hadn't fully assembled before. "Yes," Hale said again. Caleb looked at Abigail. She was looking back at him with an expression that was harder to read than usual. Not closed, but layered the way a person looks when they're holding more than one feeling at the same time and aren't sure which one to let show. "You knew," Caleb said. "When you answered the advertisement, you knew the kind of men who were already looking for you." "I suspected the reach," she said carefully. "I didn't know the specific connection to Colorado." A pause. "If I'd known you were directly in their path, I might have—" She stopped. "You might have what?" She looked at him steadily. "I might have warned you before the first letter arrived." "Instead of after." "Instead of after." She held his gaze. "I'm sorry for that." It was the first time he'd heard her apologize for anything. He didn't know what to do with it for a moment. Then he said, "You've been making up for it since." Something in her face shifted. He looked back at Hale's folder. "What does this do to the federal case?" he said. Hale sat forward. "It transforms it. A multi-state fraud conspiracy with documented financial connections is not a property dispute. It's not even a racketeering case in the simple sense. The Boston trading irregularities alone. Can the federal prosecutor use all of it?" Abigail said. "That's what I came to discuss with Fry." Hale adjusted his glasses. "I've corresponded with the federal attorney's office. They want to expand the inquiry. Formally, if I can meet with the investigator when he arrives." "He arrives Thursday," Abigail said. "Fry confirmed it this morning." Hale looked at her. "You already knew." "I've been managing the calendar," she said simply. Hale looked at Caleb. Caleb said, "She does that." The federal investigator's name was Morrison, a careful, weathered man of about 45, who had the manner of someone who had seen a great deal of human dishonesty and been permanently unimpressed by it. He arrived Thursday afternoon, reviewed Abigail's compiled case documentation for 3 hours with Hale and Fry present, and emerged from that meeting with the expression of a man who has just been handed considerably more than he expected. He asked Abigail 3 questions directly. The first was how she'd identified the notary seal inconsistency. The second was how she'd found the retired coroner. The third was why she'd come west. She answered all 3 without embellishment. When she finished, Morrison looked at his notes for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Mercer, in 15 years of federal investigation, I have seen approximately 4 instances of private evidence compilation that match the standard I'd expect from a trained investigator." He paused. "This is one of them." She looked at him calmly. "Thank you. I'm also going to ask you something that isn't my official business," he said. "Do you know a man named Arthur Bellamy Boston? Financial sector." Abigail went very still. Caleb watched it happen, the specific stillness that was different from her usual stillness, the kind that meant something had landed in a place she hadn't been guarding. "He was one of my former employers," she said. "He was arrested in Boston 11 days ago," Morrison said. "Fraud charges. Unrelated investigation separate federal case." He watched her face. "He's cooperating with prosecutors. His cooperation includes information about financial relationships with several Colorado interests." The kitchen was completely silent. "Sinclair," Caleb said, "among others." Morrison closed his folder. "I mention it because it means the case is moving faster than anticipated. The county hearing on Friday is no longer the primary concern. What happens in Denver in the next 60 days is—" He stood. "I'll need a full deposition from both of you, Monday morning in Fry's office." "We'll be there," Abigail said. Morrison left. Hale let out a long breath. Fry said, "Arthur Bellamy arrested. I did not see that coming." "Neither did I," Abigail said. And for once, just for a moment, her voice was not entirely steady. Caleb put his hand on the table. Not on her hand, he didn't do that. He wasn't there yet. Just on the table beside her hand, close enough that if she reached 3 inches, she'd find it. She looked at his hand. She didn't move, but her breathing settled. The county hearing on Friday was almost anticlimactic against everything else in motion. Fry presented the Homestead Act exemption documentation. Clara's death certificate, the burial records, the pastor's letter, the train stub with the methodical precision of a man who has stopped trying to impress anyone and simply intends to win. Sinclair's county lawyer, a man named Graves, who had clearly expected easier terrain, spent 20 minutes attacking the documentation's sufficiency and abandoned that line. When the judge, even this judge, even the one whose consistency had concerned them, looked at a burial certificate for a 3-day-old infant and a wife dead of fever and said with something real in his voice, "Counselor, move on." Graves moved on. He had nothing else that held. The ruling came the same day Homestead Act claim dismissed. Property rights confirmed as recorded. Outside the courthouse, Fry shook Caleb's hand and then Abigail's. "One down," he said. "The federal hearing is the one that matters," Abigail said. "Yes." He put his hat on. "But today wasn't nothing." He walked to his horse. Caleb and Abigail stood on the courthouse steps in the late afternoon sun. After a moment, she said, "Clara." He looked at her. "That was her name," she said. Not a question. He'd written it on the documentation, but they hadn't spoken it. "Yes," he said. "She planted good seeds," Abigail said. "In that south garden. I can tell from what came back." He looked at the street. "She would have," he said. "She was particular about her garden." Abigail nodded, quiet. Then, "The herbs are coming in well this year. I thought you should know." He thought about the garden, about Abigail asking permission to plant it and the care she'd used in asking, about the fact that she'd planted it differently as she'd offered, but tended it with the same seriousness Clara had given everything she cared about. "I noticed," he said. They walked to the wagon. Honk. The following 3 weeks were the hardest. Not because the legal situation deteriorated, it didn't. Morrison's inquiry expanded rapidly once Bellamy began cooperating, and Fry reported that Sinclair's own lawyers were showing signs of the particular anxiety that manifested when previously confident men realized the ground had shifted beneath them. The hardship was quieter than that. It was the accumulated weight of months. The burned hay, the destroyed bridge, the cut fence, the homestead filing that had reached into 1878 and pulled out the worst 16 days of Caleb's life and put them in front of a county judge. The knowledge that it wasn't over, that the Denver hearing was 60 days away, and 60 days was a long time for men who had already shown what they were willing to do. Caleb felt it in the way things accumulated, in the way his shoulders stayed tense into the evenings, in the way the early mornings felt heavier, in the way he sometimes stood in the yard at dusk and looked at the mountain and thought about how much he'd built here and how much it had cost, and whether a man was allowed to be tired of fighting for the thing he'd built without that making him a coward. He wasn't a coward. But he was tired in the particular way that wasn't about sleep. Abigail noticed. She noticed everything which he had entirely stopped being surprised by. She didn't comment on it directly, which was correct. But she did something else. She started reading aloud in the evenings. Not legal documents, not account books. Books. She had a small stack of them in her room, novels, histories, a collection of poetry she pretended not to be sentimental about, and on the 4th evening of the 3rd week, she came downstairs after supper with one of them and sat across from him at the kitchen table and simply started reading. He looked up from the fence repair diagram he'd been staring at without seeing. She didn't explain herself. She just read. He went back to the fence diagram, or he held it anyway. He wasn't looking at it. He was listening to her voice, which was steady and clear, and read with an attention to rhythm that made the words sound like they'd been written for reading aloud. They stayed like that for an hour. When she finished the chapter and closed the book, she said good night and went upstairs. He sat at the table for a while afterward. The fence diagram was exactly as unaddressed as it had been before. He felt better than he had in 3 weeks. He didn't examine why. She did it the next evening too, and the one after that, and by the end of the week, it had become the unmarked end of everyday supper, an hour of her voice reading something good night. Tom Briggs, who had eyes in the back of his head and an understanding of Caleb Mercer built from 6 years of close quarters, said nothing about this. He had the wisdom of a man who knew when to be quiet about something. Roy was less wise. Roy said to Hector, within what he believed was out of earshot, "Man's listening, like he's hearing something for the first time." Hector said, "Shh." Roy said, "I'm just saying." The letter from Sinclair himself arrived on a Monday. Not through lawyers, not through Patterson. From Sinclair directly, which was the first time the man had put his own name on anything in their direction, and that told Caleb more than the contents before he'd read a word. He read it anyway. Sinclair was proposing a settlement. Direct negotiation, no lawyers. A purchase price for the property that was. Caleb had to read the number twice substantially more than the ranch's market value. An acknowledgement that the survey dispute had created complications. A suggestion that both parties might benefit from resolution before the matter was escalated further. He brought it to Abigail. She read it in the kitchen, standing up, and when she finished, she set it on the table with the particular care of someone setting down something that needs to be thought about properly. "He's afraid," she said. "I know." The Bellamy cooperation scared him. He knows Morrison's inquiry has breadth he didn't anticipate. She looked at Caleb. "This offer," she tapped the letter, "isn't generosity. It's calculation. He wants the property transferred before the federal case formally names him, because a property that transferred by private sale after evidence of fraud was already assembled is harder for prosecutors to claw back than one that was seized through legal fraud." Caleb sat down. "He's trying to use us to protect himself." "Yes." She sat across from him. "He's also hoping you're tired enough to say yes." He looked at her across the table. "Are you tired?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You asked me that before," she said. "At the bridge." "I know." She was quiet. "I'm tired of watching men like him win," she said finally. "I'm tired of Haggerty's locked door. I'm tired of a dead man's name on a forged document." She looked at the letter. "I am not tired of this." He picked up the letter. He tore it in half. She watched him do it. "Should I tell Fry?" she said. "Tell Fry we received a settlement offer and declined." He set the two halves on the table. "Tell Morrison, too. Morrison will find it useful," she agreed. She reached for the two halves of the letter with that same careful handling. "A settlement offer made after federal inquiry opened constitutes consciousness of guilt." "I thought it might." She looked up at him with an expression that was the closest thing to warmly amused he'd seen on her face, not a smile exactly, more the place a smile would go if she let it. "You've been paying attention," she said. "You're a good teacher," he said, "even when you're not trying to be." The almost smile went a fraction further than it usually did. She looked back at the torn letter. "I'll write to Fry tonight," she said. The turning point came not in a courtroom, but in a records room in Denver 3 weeks before the formal federal hearing. Morrison's team, armed with Hale's Boston documentation and Abigail's Colorado evidence package, and the cooperation of Arthur Bellamy, subpoenaed Sinclair's financial records directly. Not the county records, not the surveying documents. The financial records of the railroad venture capital accounts, investor distributions, wire transfers, every dollar that had moved in and out of the project over 6 years. Morrison sent Fry a summary by courier. Fry came up the mountain again. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Caleb and Abigail with the expression of a man who had studied hard for a test he'd expected to be difficult and found it was over before he reached the hardest questions. "The financial records confirmed everything," he said. "The fraud is documented end to end. Boston money into Colorado acquisitions. Forged surveys to establish false ownership. Bribed county officials to process the transfers. Patterson, their regional counsel, has been formally identified as the person who directed the survey falsification." He paused. "Aldous Webb has been suspended pending investigation." Abigail closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then opened them. "Haggerty's land," she said. "The transfers are being reviewed. Every acquisition that depended on the fraudulent survey chain is contestable." Fry leaned forward. "The federal hearing in 3 weeks isn't to determine guilt. The investigation has already done that. The hearing is to establish remedies." "They're going to make Sinclair whole, the ranchers he defrauded," Caleb said. "They're going to try," Fry said. "It won't be simple. Some of it is already developed. Some transfers already had money. Move. But Haggerty's property, the Raines parcel, 2 others, the federal prosecutor is pushing for full restitution." He looked at Caleb. "Your deed was never successfully contested. Your property was never transferred. As of the federal inquiry's formal filing, any and all county-level actions against the Mercer property are stayed pending resolution." The kitchen was very quiet. Caleb heard the mountain the way he always heard it when things went still enough inside to let the outside in the wind. The cattle somewhere up the slope, the sound of a place that had been his for 14 years and had nearly been taken from him by a dead man's name on a forged piece of paper. He looked at Abigail. She was looking at the table. He thought she might be fighting something the way she sometimes fought things from the inside, where it didn't show unless you'd learn to look for it. "Abigail," he said. She looked up. "You did this," he said. She shook her head immediately. "Fry did this. Hale did this. Morrison. You found the notary seal. You tracked the dead surveyor. You organized 60 pages of documentation that gave Morrison something to work with. You wrote to the other families when I didn't think to." He looked at her directly the way she always looked at him. "You came to a ranch in Colorado with a carpetbag and a notebook, and you undid something that had been running for years." She held his gaze. She was doing what she always did, holding herself steady, holding the feelings where she kept them in the controlled interior space that had been built by years of needing to hold herself together without help. But something in her eyes was different. "I needed somewhere that couldn't be taken from me," she said quietly. "You gave me that." He looked at her for a long moment. The thing that had been sitting unnamed in the dark of his bedroom for months was still unnamed. He wasn't going to name it at this table with Fry sitting 3 feet away, looking out the window with heroic tact. But he thought tomorrow, or the next day, or soon, he was going to name it. He looked back at Fry. "What happens next?" he said. Fry put his hands on the table. "We go to Denver. We testify. We let the federal court do what federal courts exist to do." He paused. "And then you come home." Caleb looked around the kitchen. The organized shelves. The account books on their proper shelf. The satchel by the door that was as much a fixture of this room now as the stove. The garden visible through the east window, coming in green and purposeful. "Yes," he said. He looked at Abigail. "We come home." The federal hearing in Denver lasted 3 days. Caleb had never spent 3 consecutive days in a courtroom before, and he discovered that it was nothing like the county hearings he'd attended over the years, the small procedural affairs where a judge read documents and 2 lawyers argued about language, and everyone went home for supper. The federal district courtroom operated at a different scale entirely, with a weight of formality that pressed on a man's shoulders from the moment he walked through the door. They stayed at a boarding house 6 blocks from the courthouse. Caleb in one room, Abigail in the one next to it, Hale and Fry across the hall. Morrison had his own arrangements. The first evening they ate supper together, at a table in the boarding house dining room, all 4 of them going over the next day's testimony order with the focused quiet of people who have done everything they can do and are now simply waiting for the moment when it either holds or it doesn't. Fry said, "The opposing counsel is a man named Whitmore. He's good. He'll try to reframe the survey chain as administrative error rather than deliberate fraud." "The dead man's signature isn't administrative error," Abigail said. "He'll argue it's a transcription mistake, that the wrong surveyor name was entered into the record. Then we ask him to explain why J.T. Alcott's signature appears on 4 separate survey documents across 2 years when Alcott died in February of 1871. 1 transcription mistake is an error, 4 is a pattern." She cut her bread without looking up. "Dr. Marsh will be there tomorrow." "Arriving on the morning train," Fry confirmed. The retired coroner, 81 years old, had agreed to testify without hesitation when Fry's letter reached him. His exact response, which Fry had read aloud to Caleb with something approaching admiration, was, "I certified that man's death with my own hand. If someone has been writing his name on documents afterward, I consider that a personal offense." Hale smiled at that. Abigail said, "Good." Caleb ate his supper and said little. He wasn't nervous exactly. Nerves implied uncertainty about whether you were doing the right thing. He had no uncertainty about that. What he felt was the particular tension of a man who has put everything he has into something and is now in the phase that is out of his hands. He looked across the table at Abigail, who was reviewing her notes for the 4th time with the same focused attention she'd given them the first time, because thoroughness was not about repetition for her, it was about finding the one thing she might have missed. She hadn't missed anything. He'd known that for a long time. He ate the rest of his supper and thought about going home. The first day of testimony belonged to Morrison. The federal investigator was exactly what Caleb had understood him to be in their first meeting, a man who had converted 15 years of patience into an unshakable command of detail. He walked the court through the evidence chain with the methodical precision of someone building a structure that needed to hold weight from every direction. The Boston financial records, the Colorado survey falsifications, the Bellamy connection, the money trail that ran from a trading company's fraudulent accounts directly into a railroad ventures acquisition budget. Whitmore objected at regular intervals. The judge sustained approximately 1 in 8 of them. By the afternoon session, Whitmore had adjusted his strategy from attacking the evidence to attacking the framing, arguing that the financial connection between Boston and Colorado was correlation, not conspiracy, and that survey irregularities at the county level were outside the federal court's proper jurisdiction. The judge asked him to clarify his position on the Comstock property, which crossed county lines. Whitmore clarified. The judge listened. Then he said, "Counselor, the moment this scheme crossed a county boundary, it entered federal jurisdiction. That is not a framing choice. That is geography." He looked at his notes. "Continue, Mr. Morrison." Whitmore sat down. Caleb watched from the gallery, and beside him he felt Abigail exhale just slightly, just once, and then she was still again.
Montreal.
The second day was harder. Whitmore had recalibrated overnight, abandoning the jurisdictional argument and moving to the one Abigail had predicted from the beginning, discrediting her. He introduced the Boston Trading Company dismissal. He characterized her departure as termination for cause. He produced a letter signed by 2 of her former supervisors, alleging that her analysis of the company accounts had contained significant errors, and that her claims of financial irregularities had been investigated internally and found to be without merit. The letter was, Caleb recognized a very good piece of work, for a piece of work that was entirely false. He looked at Abigail in the witness chair. She was looking at Whitmore with an expression that he had learned over months meant she had already seen this coming and had already prepared for exactly this moment and was waiting with the particular patience of someone who knows precisely when to move. Whitmore finished his presentation of the letter. Fry stood. "Your Honor, the defense has introduced a letter from 2 individuals whose names appear in the federal investigation's financial records as signatories to fraudulent account transfers." He set his own documents on the evidence table. Mr. Garrett Hale, who investigated those transfers independently over a period of 3 years, is prepared to testify that both signatories were themselves subjects of a separate fraud inquiry that resulted in the arrest of one Arthur Bellamy 11 weeks ago. He paused. The letter introduced by opposing counsel was written by 2 men who are currently cooperating witnesses in a federal prosecution. Its credibility as a character reference is... He looked at Whitmore, limited. The judge looked at Whitmore. Whitmore said, "Your Honor." "I'll hear from Mr. Hale," the judge said. Hale took the witness chair. He was precise, thorough, and unemotional in the way of a man who has spent decades making facts speak for themselves. He explained what the Boston investigation had found. He explained what Abigail had brought to him, and when, and what he had independently verified. He explained the connection between the men who had signed Whitmore's letter and the financial fraud they had themselves committed. When he finished, Whitmore attempted a cross-examination. It lasted 11 minutes before he sat down. Caleb watched Abigail's face during Hale's testimony. She held herself very still, as always. But he could see, because he had learned to see the slight shift of something in her expression when Hale described what she had brought him. Not pride. Something quieter and more complicated. The look of a person hearing the story of their own suffering, described accurately in public by someone who had been there for it. She had carried that for 6 years. He thought about that. He thought about it for the rest of the day. The third day brought Dr. Marsh. He was 81 years old, and he walked into the courtroom with a cane and the absolute moral authority of a man who had spent 50 years recording the honest facts of human life and death and had not once been asked to compromise them. He took the witness chair. Fry showed him the survey document bearing J.T. Alcott's name. He showed him his own death certificate for J.T. Alcott dated February 14, 1871. He asked Dr. Marsh if the signature on the death certificate was his. "It is," Dr. Marsh said. He asked Dr. Marsh if he had any doubt about the date of James Thomas Alcott's death. "None whatsoever," Dr. Marsh said. "I was present. I signed the certificate the same day. I remember the family clearly." He asked Dr. Marsh whether, in his professional opinion, a man who died in February of 1871 could have conducted a land survey in October of 1871. Dr. Marsh looked at the survey document. He looked at Whitmore. He looked at the judge. "No," he said. He could not. The courtroom was very quiet. Whitmore did not cross-examine Dr. Marsh. The ruling came the following morning, delivered with the efficient gravity of a federal judge who had made his determination before he sat down and was now informing the room of the fact. The survey chain underlying Sinclair's Colorado acquisitions was fraudulent. The documents were void. The transfers executed on the basis of those documents were invalid and subject to reversal. Harold Sinclair was referred to the federal prosecutor for criminal indictment on charges of conspiracy to commit fraud, with additional charges to follow pending the outcome of the Bellamy cooperation. Patterson, his regional counsel, was similarly referred. Aldous Webb, the county records clerk with 30 years of access and watery eyes, was referred to the state attorney's office. The Mercer property deed stood as recorded, uncontested, final. Every acquisition Sinclair had made through the fraudulent survey chain was frozen pending individual property reviews with the court, expressing its intent to restore original ownership wherever restoration was legally possible. Fry shook Caleb's hand. Then he shook Abigail's. Then he took off his hat and held it against his chest for a moment, like a man in church. Hale embraced Abigail briefly, the way a colleague embraces someone after a long shared fight, and said something quiet in her ear that Caleb didn't hear. She nodded once. Caleb stood at the edge of all of this and watched her, the woman who had come off a stagecoach 9 months ago with a carpet bag and a handshake and a notebook full of the kind of thinking that didn't quit, and felt something settle in his chest that had been restless for a very long time. She caught him watching. She held his gaze across the room. He crossed to where she was standing. He didn't have a speech prepared. He was not a man who prepared speeches. He said the thing that was true. "Let's go home," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. Haggerty was waiting at the base of the mountain road when they came down from Denver. He was sitting on his wagon with his hat in his hands, the way he'd sat at their kitchen table, and when he saw them coming, he stood up, which clearly cost his old joints something, and he stood there while they pulled up. Caleb stopped the wagon. Haggerty looked at them both. "I heard," he said. "Fry sent word." "It's not finished yet," Caleb said. "Your property review will take time. There are no guarantees about—" "I know." Haggerty's voice was steady. "I know that." He paused. "I came to say—" He stopped, tried again. "I came to say that whatever happens with the land, whatever the court decides—" He looked at Abigail directly. "You gave an old man his dignity back, and that counts for something I don't have the right words for." Abigail looked at him. She said, "Get your land back, Mr. Haggerty. That's the only thanks I want." He pressed his lips together. He nodded. He put his hat back on and climbed back up to his wagon with the deliberate care of a man preserving his composure, and he drove away toward the valley without looking back, because some things a man processes better when he's moving. Caleb watched him go. Then he clicked the horses forward, and they went up the mountain. The ranch looked different when they pulled into the yard. Not different in any physical way. Tom and Hector and Roy had kept it exactly as it should be, and everything was where it belonged, but different the way a place looks when you've been away long enough to see it fresh, the way familiarity peels back for a moment and lets you see the actual thing underneath. Caleb sat on the wagon for a moment after they stopped. He looked at the main barn and the repaired southeast barn roof and the rebuilt bridge and the north fence line that was straight now and had been straight for months, and the house with the east window, that caught the morning light, and the garden on the south side that was fully in bloom and had been tended while they were gone by. He found out later Hector who had done it without being asked because he'd noticed it mattered. Tom came out of the barn and looked at them both and said, "Well, we won," Caleb said. Tom Briggs, who in 6 years had expressed strong emotion approximately twice, took off his hat and turned it over in his hands and said, "Good." Then he put it back on. "Supper's been kept warm. Roy made biscuits." He went back into the barn. Caleb got down from the wagon. He helped Abigail down, and this time, for the first time, she let him. She put her hand in his and stepped down, and he kept hold of it for exactly a moment longer than the assistance required, and she didn't pull it back. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. "Thank you," he said. "For the 10th time, maybe. I've lost count." "You don't need to keep counting," she said. "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it directly." She waited. "I told you when you arrived that this was a practical arrangement," he said. "That was true when I said it. I meant every word of it, and I wasn't wrong to mean it." He paused. "It's not true anymore." She was very still. "I don't know when it changed," he said. "I know it was gradual, the way everything real is gradual." He looked at their hands, her hand still in his. "I know it was the boot full of receipts, and the 4 o'clock mornings, and the way you asked permission to plant Clara's garden. I know it was the bridge, and Haggerty's face at the kitchen table, and the night you read to me when I didn't know I needed someone to." He stopped. "I know it's not what either of us planned." "No," she said. Her voice was steady and quiet. "It isn't." "Is it?" He stopped. Tried again. He was better with actions than words, and always had been, but this required words. "Is it something you'd consider?" She looked at him for a long time. "Caleb," she said, "I answered one advertisement. In all of Boston, in all the newspapers I read, in all the months I spent trying to figure out what came next, I answered one. Yours." She let her hand rest more fully in his, a choice rather than an accident. "I think I knew before I got off the stagecoach." He said, "You looked at me like you were cataloging the property." "I was." The almost smile finally became a real one, not large, not dramatic, just completely genuine, the real thing after months of almost. "And you passed." He laughed. It came out of him the way things come out of a person who hasn't done something in a long time and had forgotten it was still available, sudden real unguarded. He couldn't have said the last time he'd laughed like that. He wasn't sure he could have said the last time he'd laughed at all. Abigail looked at him with the real smile still on her face, and something in her eyes that was warm and certain, and had probably been there longer than either of them had been ready to say so. "Come inside," she said. "Roy made biscuits." They told the hands at supper, which was unnecessary, because the hands already knew Tom Briggs had eyes in the back of his head, and Roy had seen the hand-holding from the barn window, and Hector had apparently predicted this outcome 3 months ago, and won a small wager with Roy about the timing details of which Roy declined to confirm. Pete Dawson rode up from the lower pasture where he'd been working the past 2 months, and heard the news, and sat at the supper table with the expression of a man whose judgment has been thoroughly vindicated. "I told you," he said to Caleb. "You told me I needed a partner," Caleb said. "You didn't tell me anything else." "Didn't need to," Pete said serenely, and helped himself to biscuits. 6 weeks after the Denver hearing, the first of the property reversals came through. Not Haggerty's. That one took longer, complicated by the transfer documentation and the improvements Sinclair's people had begun on the property. But the Morrison parcel on the south end of the valley, a smaller homestead belonging to a widow named Constance Morrison, who had sold under the same pressure and moved to her daughter's home in town, was returned. Caleb drove out to tell her himself. Abigail came with him. Constance Morrison was 67 years old and had the bird-like quality of someone who had gotten small from carrying something heavy for a long time. She sat at her daughter's kitchen table and listened to Caleb explain what the court had ordered, and she was very quiet for a moment, and then she said, "My husband's tools are still in the barn. I never let them clear the barn." "Your barn," Caleb said. She looked at Abigail. "Your doing," she said. "A great many people's doing," Abigail said. "Yours first," Constance Morrison said, with the quiet finality of a woman who does not waste words and will not be argued with on facts. Haggerty's land came back in the fall. The process was complicated, and the legal language was dense, and it took 2 additional hearings and Fry's complete attention for 6 weeks. But on a Thursday in October, a county sheriff's deputy drove out to the Haggerty land with a federal order in hand and removed the lock from the door. Haggerty's daughter called for him. He drove out alone. He walked up to the door. He put his hand on it. He stood there for a long time. Then he went inside. Caleb heard about it from Fry, who heard it from the deputy. He told Abigail that evening at the kitchen table where she was working on the fall account books, with the efficiency that had transformed the ranch's financial picture so thoroughly, that the bank in town had sent an unsolicited letter complimenting the management of the account. She set the pen down when he told her. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "Good." 1 word. He knew what it held. The neighbors began coming in the winter, not all at once, one at a time the way people come when they're not sure of their welcome, and arrive early enough to leave easily if needed. A rancher from the North Valley, who'd received a letter similar to Sinclair's, but hadn't sold yet. A widow with a deed question. A young couple who'd just arrived from Kansas and didn't understand their homestead documentation and had heard there was a woman on the mountain ranch who could read a land contract. Abigail met them all at the kitchen table. She reviewed their documents with the same focused attention she'd given every document that had ever crossed this table. She explained what she found. She told them what Fry could help with and what they could handle themselves with the right information. She never charged them. Caleb watched this happen and said nothing for 3 weeks. Then he said at supper, "You should charge them." "They can't afford to pay," she said. "Some of them can." She looked at him. "The ones who can are helping the ones who can't without being asked. I've noticed." She picked up her fork. "That seems like a reasonable economy." He thought about this. "You're building something," he said. She looked at him. "We're building something," she said. Caleb began opening the ranch to travelers in the spring. It wasn't planned. It started with a family whose wagon broke a wheel on the mountain road in the dark in the rain, and who came to the ranch door not knowing what they'd find, and found supper and a dry place to sleep, and Hector cheerfully repairing the wheel at first light. They left in the morning with directions and the particular brightness of people who have been unexpectedly helped. And 2 weeks later, Caleb received a letter from the father of the family, thanking him by name, and saying he'd told everyone he met. After that, they came more regularly. Travelers moving west, families relocating. Once a circuit preacher who stayed 4 days and helped Roy fix the water trough, and preached an informal Sunday service in the yard that half the valley attended, including old Haggerty, who drove up the mountain road on his own for the first time since getting his land back. Tom Briggs handled all of it with the unflappable competence of a man who has simply expanded his understanding of what this ranch does without being asked to adjust his principles. Roy said to no one in particular, "This ranch used to be quiet." "Do you want it to be quiet again?" Hector asked. Roy considered this. "No," he said. "Quiet was lonelier than I thought." The morning Caleb finally said what had been accumulating since the stagecoach, and the cataloging look, and the boot full of receipts, was a Sunday in late spring, a year and 2 months after Abigail had stepped off the stage. They were standing on the hill behind the house that overlooked the rebuilt fields, and the pastures, and the valley below, and the mountain above, and everything in between that they had defended and repaired and planted and built side by side across 4 seasons of ordinary and extraordinary days. It was a clear morning, the kind that Colorado produced occasionally, as if apologizing for the storms. He had been meaning to say it properly for a while and hadn't found the right moment, or had found moments and decided they weren't right, and he had finally concluded that there was no such thing as the perfect moment, and you simply had to say the true thing when it was true. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I put an advertisement in a newspaper," he said, "because Pete told me to, and because the books were in a boot, and the hay barn was losing money, and I thought what I needed was someone who could help me survive another season." He paused. "I thought I was ordering a practical solution to a practical problem." "I know," she said. "You told me that on the first night. I know I did." He turned to look at her directly. "I was wrong about what I needed. I was right about you, but I was wrong about what I needed." He held her gaze. "I needed someone who would stay when staying was hard. Someone who wouldn't let me give up when I was close to it. Someone who looked at everything I'd built and didn't see what was missing, they saw what was worth keeping." He paused. "I thought I needed help for my ranch." She was watching him with those gray eyes that had never once looked away from the hard thing. "But God sent me the miracle that saved my life," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The mountain was quiet around them. Then she stepped forward and put her hand against his chest, not dramatically, not with declaration, just her hand, and the solid reality of it, her palm over his heart, and she looked up at him and said, "I came west with a carpetbag, and nowhere left to belong." "I know," he said. "You gave me a home," she said. "And then you let me help you keep it." Her hand pressed slightly. "That's not a small thing, Caleb. For someone who'd had everything taken. That's—" She stopped, tried again. "That's everything." He covered her hand with his. He didn't need to say anything else. She didn't either. They stood on the hill above everything they'd built in the clear spring morning, with the fields coming in green below them, and the cattle moving on the upper slope, and the sound of Hector laughing at something Roy said, drifting up from the yard and the garden Clara had planted years ago, growing full and tended in the south yard and the kitchen table, where all the hard work had been done waiting inside, and the north fence straight, and the hay barn solid, and the bridge rebuilt, and the account books in order, and the lock off Haggerty's door, and Constance Morrison's husband's tools back in their proper barn. All of it real. All of it held. Caleb looked at his wife, not the practical arrangement, not the mail-order solution, not the woman from the advertisement, but his wife, the one who had come west with nothing, and remade everything, and refused to quit when quitting would have been understandable. And he knew with the clarity of a man who has finally stopped being afraid of certainty that this was the truest thing his life had ever produced. Not the ranch, not the land they'd saved, not the legal victory in a Denver courtroom. This, two people who had both lost everything choosing day after ordinary day to carry the weight of living until it became something neither of them could have built alone, and finding on the other side of all that carrying that, what they'd built together was the kind of life that neither loss nor fraud nor forged documents, nor the full force of men with money and lawyers could take from them. Because it wasn't in the deed, it was in them. And that was something no one could ever touch.